city in Hong Kong was, in fact, a capitalist endeavor. The first garden city suburbs that came closest to Howard's original, in terms of its location away from the city and in its planning, were initiated by private enterprises as early as the 1920s in Kowloon. Why was this so? The attractiveness of the garden city model during the interwar period could be attributed to a number of factors. Number one, Kowloon had been designated as a country picnic area for the Europeans since the mid-19th century to get away from the overcrowded city on the island, that is Hong Kong Island. Number two, there was a shortage for houses for the middle-class population, which had grown after the First World War. And number three, the ownership of a small house and a garden had appealed to that group of population who wished to differentiate themselves. And clearly, developers saw this as an opportunity. Suffice to say that the garden city, oh, thank you, with a socialist, just uncap it, sorry. Suffice to say that the garden city with a socialist vision extended only to a pre-select group of both economic, there was both at once an economic and a, thank you, and colonial enterprise. Isn't Kyung Park so kind? The Kowloon Tong, which is the name of this development, and the new territories were registered in 1922 to put into execution a plan for a quote-unquote garden city. And these terms, by the way, are actively used, as you can tell, even in the media. The promoters of this company had a vision of a planned community, which one could argue is really the beginning of gated communities for middle-class families and with houses and bungalows surrounded by lavishly planted gardens. So here again, media picks that up quite well. As in fact, not only did they acquire pleasant properties at a reasonable price, the area retains a distinctive character that bespoke the middle-class English ideal of a house and a garden per family in a picturesque setting. So whereas the houses in Kowloon Tong Garden suburb bore the imprint of a single designer, and the entire estate had been designated a heritage compound, the story of the Kaduri Avenue estate, this is another housing development, developed by the Hong Kong Engineering and Construction Company, turns out to be quite different. Making no pretense at a social vision, the company had announced in 1932 that the estate was to allow for house ownership and for the affluent. And they released a plan of the estate with beautiful, winding, relaxed, tree-lined streets. And all this happened in 1938. Moving on, case number two is a sort of a historical trajectory, if you like, a sort of discursive one, was a 14-story block apartment building called the Fofar House. It was built by the Singapore Improvement Trust back in 1956. It stood within the first high-rise housing estate planned by the trust, which is in effect a colonial improvement trust belonging to the British, of course. Architecturally, it contained elements that reveal an attempt on the part of the designers to translate the modern aesthetic into the tropical climate, practically following Maxwell Fry's concept of the tropical modern, if you like. The staggered form of the block, the raised pilotis, where shops were inserted in between, if you look at the bottom bubble, the curved beveled parapet that ran full length of the corridor on every level that gave rise to smooth, streamlined forms and appearances. These very much fall in line with sort of the modern aesthetic. And this is a Fofar house in that housing estate. And the plans that differentiate itself sort of quite from typical plans. Then quickly, case number three, Toa Payoh is the name of new town in Singapore. was in fact the second new town that was being developed in Singapore shortly after the independence of Singapore. It was designed and built from tabula rasa. Um, it embodied all the ideals of the new government for the newly decolonized island nation. So one could argue that the garden had made its way back onto the ground at the urban scale. If you look at this black and white photo, the valorized plain, if you like, that was coined by Le Corbusier, it's all green. It's all playgrounds. It's all paved squares and open green spaces. At least during its inception, the garden city idea in the form of Toa Payoh New Town is most explicit in its plan, where the ideas of housing and green spaces and the structuring of the community were designed. No longer was green just conceived as spaces for people, but the new town was in fact consistently linked to international and local debates that were taking place in the 1970s. And here the high-profile and well-publicized 1976 Habitat Conference on Human Settlements that was held in Toronto had explicitly made references to Toa Payoh New Town. The scheme, Toa Payoh, was presented as a success story at the conference. Not only did it deal with physical problems of housing with a large working class population, it produced a nascent community of people that came with the citizenship. In this case, a new citizenship, given that Singapore was just newly founded, independent then, and it gave everyone a positive stake in home ownership and, in a sense, the construction of national identity. And architects and planners, especially those who had been exposed to the discourses and projects in Europe and the United States, and in this case, People's Park Complex, designed by William Lim, who is one of these privileged architects who had functioned and was educated in Europe and the United States, had brought ideas from their experiences elsewhere. So in the 1970s, there was a spurt of mixed-use complexes in which concourses, leisure, and shopping spaces were carved out of lower-level podiums. And one of these controversial and high-profile projects was the one that I'm showing you right now. Green was considered visual leisure, partially fulfilled by the public parks and trees lining the roads. You see a lot of that in this photo. And shopping was soon touted as the quote-unquote national pastime, and it became a sort of a direct opponent to the garden in the contestation of space. Case 4, the currency of green. Here, in a public effort to present their own histories, Singapore is the Housing Development Board, in this case a sort of spread of their projects over the years, and Hong Kong Housing Authority attempted respectively to organize the housing developments through the decades. The stories are more or less identical, beginning with a crisis in the 50s with resettlement housing programs, and later to new towns and sort of a celebration of success, and finally a return to architectural aesthetics. This time round, not unlike the experiments of modernist architects, and of course Min Suk had pointed us to Hilbert Seimer, designs that would correspond and showcase contemporary lifestyles. Of late, it appears that the public housing landscape of Singapore is undergoing a greening transformation, and from 1963 onwards, Singapore officially officially thought of and sort of developed and actively advertised itself as a garden city. Though the greening of Singapore began in the 1960s,